Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Who have we got online today? We've got Hans, is it Joachim? Joachim, I think so. Trish is online. Paul is still in his RV. Paul, are you ever going to leave that RV? That's a question. Maybe one day. Hughes in the Netherlands. Robert from Illinois. Jan from Tilburg in the Netherlands. There's a couple of you in the Netherlands, San Diego, where we got elsewhere, other places in California, Mexico, Germany, Switzerland. Okay, cool. So, as Trish has actually just pointed out, the change in time conflicts with the Capture One Quick Live. It does indeed. See, this is what happens when we ask Jerry to decide what time we should broadcast. However, it actually looks like it's not exactly a clash. Literally, David just finishes and then we carry on, but maybe we'll see if we can do some tweaking around the days rather than necessarily the time. Okay, Paul has just confirmed that he is never going to leave his RV, and I felt sorry for you to start with in lockdown because you were stuck in it. Anyway, let's get going. So, for those of you that have just been doing the edit with us with David, welcome across. For those of you that haven't, David's just done an edit with us and you've missed it. So, we are going through, obviously, same sort of deal. So, build 13.1 is still current at the point in time that we're recording this session. That's 20.1 from a marketing point of view, or 13.1 in the code base. Don't get confused. They mean exactly the same thing. It was just a rename to version 20 that's made this particular version a bit complex. That means that we're running with the May update, which has the healing brush changes and also the before and after, and we'll be using that in this session. So if you don't have version 20, try and upgrade. If you don't have Capture One at all, then obviously you can download the free trial version. That works for 30 days with no limitations. And if you have an alternative, then have a look at what we're doing today and then make a decision. Don't have to switch to Capture One. You can stay in the dark. There's an interesting quote. Okay, so let's go into Capture One. And I can't remember who it was that someone asked about dual exposure plus in phase one cameras and whether we could show it in this session. So yes, we're going to today. Just for reference, hopefully the blinking issue we had last time has been fixed. We've had to do a little bit of a weird thing to get it working, but hopefully it's all okay and hopefully the sound is good and we're all ready to go. So let's have a look at dual exposure. So for those of you that don't know what dual exposure is, it's slightly different. So you'll hear lots of things like dual pixel raw, dual exposure, frame averaging, all these different terms. I'm going to cover exactly what dual exposure does in a phase one camera, why it's important, and actually why sometimes the stuff that happens in a phase one camera, which can be, phase one system is between 30 and 50,000 pounds or dollars or whatever, why that's actually important to other cameras later on, because it typically tends to trickle down. So let's have a little look at this particular image. So this is a shot that was taken, a single shot, 0.8 seconds, we can see down the bottom, at f8 on a 35mm lens in ISO 50. So it should be pretty clean, right? And we can see here it's been exposed correctly for the highlights. So we haven't lost anything in terms of detail in the highlights. We might want to bring some of it back with HDR. But the downside to exposing to the highlights, obviously, is that we have lost a lot of the shadow detail. But obviously this was shot with a phase one camera, and as a result of the phase one dynamic range, we can pull up a lot of shadow detail without losing too much detail. So let's do that. Let's pull up the shadows to 100. Oops, I'm on a mask. I was playing with it earlier. Let me just reset, and now let's pull up the shadows to 100. Okay, so there's all the detail that was actually in that shot. There's a whole lot of structure and texture and whatever on the building. We can go into here, into this area here, and we can see all of this paintwork and all this cool stuff here as well. But by bringing up the detail in the shadow, what we've also brought up is noise. And there are two things with noise. One, it looks a little bit ugly. Two, you actually lose a little bit of sharpness, because obviously where you've got that noise and that sort of speckly approach to all the dots on the screen, you tend to lose definition on edges. So what dual pixel does is it actually takes two shots simultaneously, or almost simultaneously. They call it instantaneously, but it's virtually at the same time. One which is exposed as you would normally do for the highlights, and one which is exposed for a much longer period of time to a certain number of stops, and then it actually blends the two in the raw file in the camera. Now, what that means is, if I look at this picture here, so this is a single shot, not dual exposure. This is the dual exposure shot. You see there's no difference. There's no difference that's discernible in those two raw shots. But if I pull up our shadows by 100%, and also let's pull up the black scale up by 20, and I'm just going to copy those settings and apply them to the dual exposure shot. I'm going to select both of these shots together. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into that little area down here, the same area. And let's go to, we're going to be really unfair and go to 400%, which is ridiculous. What we've now got here, and bear in mind I haven't turned on any purple fringing or anything like that, what we've now got on the right compared to on the left is a lot sharper detail and less noise. So if we look in this area here, we've got all this color noise as well in there, whereas here it's nice and clean. Now I'm being very unfair at this because unfortunately we've got to zoom in quite a lot in order for you to see it. But in general terms, what the dual exposure option is doing for us is giving us the ability to expose for highlights while keeping detail and texture in the shadows, and especially here. So if you look underneath this R logo here, on the left hand side, the single image, we've actually got a lot of texture that's missing in that shot. On the right hand side, we've got an awful lot of that texture back. So if you compare this area here to this area here, once it's refreshed, there we go, we've got all of the detail and the texture without bringing up any extra noise. So it's sharper, it's cleaner, and it comes as a result of doing two shots at the same time effectively and then blending them in RAW. It's still only one RAW file, but the Phase 1 camera is capable of being able to do that in one go and delivering you one image with nice and clean shadows, nice and noise-free shadows as well, which is very important, without blowing out any of the highlights. So you don't have to worry about doing two shots and blending them yourselves. The camera will do it itself. There is another option with the Phase 1 cameras, which is something called frame averaging, which is cleaner still in the case of a long exposure shot. So if I were to do those same settings as well, go into this same area here, on a frame average shot, so this isn't where it's taken just two shots and blended them, it's taken several shots. I don't remember exactly how many in this one, but it's probably something upwards of 30 or 40 shots. So effectively it's brought out all of this detail without any noise as a result of doing frame averaging. So we have here, which is our single shot with all the noise and unfortunately blurriness that comes as a result. We've got here, which is our dual exposure, which you can see the difference between here and here, the level of texture, the level of detail without any noise. That's the most powerful part of dual exposure. And then we can go one further, which is into frame averaging, which is even cleaner still. The problem with frame averaging is you have to do it over a long period of time to get the cleanliness, whereas with dual exposure, as I say, it's done almost instantaneously for each shot. Same would apply if we go to another image here. So let's have a look at this one. Let's pull up all those shadows. There we go. So let's zoom into, let's say, there was a dark bit in this window here. So here is our standard shot, single shot. We can see all the noise in the window. We've lost a lot of detail and texture around here. It's not very sharp. And let's just apply the same to the dual exposure. There, so we go from here, which is full of noise, not particularly sharp, losing quite a lot of texture in there, which is nice and pin sharp. Exactly the same process. I only clicked the camera shutter once, but the camera actually took the two shots at the same time, blends them together in the shadows, and then ultimately you've got the frame averaged version, which is cleaner still, but obviously with the risk that unfortunately with frame averaging, as I say, we're doing it over a long period of time, so you get this in a long exposure. Whereas on the dual exposure, we don't. We've got a little guy moving there, but it was a relatively quick exposure. So what dual exposure does is it gives you some of the benefits of a multi-layered exposure, but in a very short exposure time that's blended in the camera. Now, why that's important in terms of on a Phase 1 is because a lot of this stuff, when it gets in at the very top of the industry, over time it trickles down. So when you start seeing cameras start to develop, or so-called develop, things like, oh, we've got this ability to do multi-exposure in one frame and so on, where you'll find a lot of this comes from is the R&D that people like Phase 1 are doing. So keep an eye on what the Phase 1 kit's doing, because quite often you'll find a version of that, maybe a cut-down version, but a version of it ends up in slightly more consumer-grade cameras. Okay, so let's just look at some questions that we've got up. So I'd really love to see you use the Luma range to bring out those shadow details instead of the simplicity of the shadow and black sliders. We'll probably do that on another shot in a second, Holland, rather than this one in particular, because this one's exactly specifically for a dual exposure example. We've got an issue with Andy on printing. I'll need to have a look at that separately, Andy. I'll take that offline because I need to actually test that, and we won't do that on screen. Jim saying if they would just add that to the IQ3. Yeah, so phase one launched both frame averaging and dual exposure on the IQ4 digital backs. Simply put, the IQ3 isn't powerful enough to be able to do it, unfortunately. It's a slightly different setup in the IQ4. It's more powerful. It's got I think a bit more memory, is certainly a faster processor, and unfortunately it needs that to be able to do all that processing in the camera at the time of capture. Where are we? I'd love to see a dual exposure plus dedicated tool inside Capture One. Yeah, with more. I mean, to be honest, yeah, yes and no. So effectively, remember that all the dual exposure is doing is allowing you to bring up shadow detail without noise. Everything else about this shot is exactly the same. So you'd apply the same logic. You'd still do the same with Luma masks, the same with your normal masks and your gradients and so on, the same with your highlight recovery and so on. So I don't think it necessarily needs its own set of tools. But yeah, I mean, potentially, maybe if you can flag that it's a dual exposure image, that might help too. Okay, so in terms of other images then, so let's get back to our Capture One stuff rather than a Phase One session. And we're going to do some quick ones today, actually. We're going to do some quick ones and some more in-depth ones. So this is a shot from Jerry in, I don't remember where, it looks somewhere definitely European. Sorry, I forgot where it is. So let's have a little look at what we're going to do. And this is a really, really quick way of making this photograph pop a little bit, but also get some of the detail back. So what we've got in this shot is an awful lot of blown out areas, and we can see that in the histogram up here. So that histogram on the right hand side is showing us there's an awful lot of stuff that's overexposed. So we've got to be very careful. Andy's just said it's Paris. Of course it's Paris. I'm being stupid. Isn't that Notre Dame? Yeah, sadly before it burned, I think. Crikey, yeah. So here we go, Paris. So let's straighten it up first. Let's draw a line across this wall. Now we don't have the corresponding wall on the other side of this bridge, but if I let go here and make sure, look at this dotted line, and all I'm doing is I'm making sure that dotted line is hitting all the way along that wall up until the wall doesn't exist anymore, and I'm having to hope that the rest of it is okay, which it looks pretty good. Now I've done the straightening, now we can see we've got a keystone issue. So I think in one of the pro tips videos that we've got on YouTube, we talk about make sure the image is straight before you go into keystoning. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself into a bit of a rabbit's warren and not come out the other side. So once you've got it straight, which we do now, let's now put some keystone correction in. And the keystone correction in this, we're going to do it relatively subtle, so not all the way along. We're just going to go, and I'm finding a line that roughly matches this line here of this church, and a line that's going to roughly match this line here of the wall here, and we're going to hit apply. Okay, it's done a pretty good job. It's also done me a bit of a favor because this boat down here was a little bit distracting. So by removing the boat through that crop, so you see what the keystone tool has had to do is had to effectively stretch the top to make this straight. So these lines are now vertical, which is what we want. So in the keystone tool, remember, all you want to do is literally drag these 4 dots so that the 2 dotted lines follow the lines that you want to be straight. Not the lines that are straight, the lines that you want to be straight. So this is especially important for buildings. So let's press the little arrow button and that applies it. Now what that's done, as I said, that crop has become quite useful because it's got rid of the boat down here. And now let's look at this building down here, because in here we can see an awful lot of blown out detail, blown out highlights. Now before we go any further, you see this, so quite often in these sessions we talk about purple fringing, and I don't have an example to show you. Here is a good example of purple fringing. So along here, let's just zoom in nice and tight up to 400, let's say, and let's go to our lens. And let's put on chromatic aberration correction and diffraction, and most importantly purple fringing. I'm going to set this quite high. What that's done, as you can see, is it's gotten rid of that horrible magenta line that's along the high contrast point in this tree. So where you'll find purple fringing specifically is where you've got a high contrast difference between a solid line, which is dark, and a solid area behind or in front, which is bright light. So whenever you see that contrast line, have a look close up, because you might find there's some purple fringing that you need Capture One to get rid of. Now we've done that, we can now start playing with some of the corrections in here. So in here, we have, as I say, our highlights being pretty blown out. So let's have a look in here and use our high dynamic range to correct for them. So let's pull our highlights back. In fact, let's go to 100% so you can see the maximum that we can do. There's an awful lot more detail there that the camera actually captured, but obviously it wasn't shown in the initial histogram. So rather than pulling it all the way back, because by doing that, I'm just going to zoom out. By doing that, we tend to flatten the image. So flattening the image isn't something we don't want. We want to keep contrast, but in this case, the image to start with was really too contrasty. So I'm going to pull the white slider back a little bit and the highlight slider back a little bit too, because I still want some contrast in. If you look at what happened to the histogram, if I just temporarily reset this tool, look at that peak on the right hand side of the histogram. So we've got rid of that peak, but what we haven't done is shifted everything into the middle, so we haven't lost too much contrast, and that's really important here. So beyond that, actually, if I really wanted to reduce contrast, and here's a fun tweak. So we've always talked about levels being the bottom part, so how to stretch a histogram to make it more contrasty. But we can also use the top part of the histogram to shrink a histogram to make it less contrasty. So let me give you an example. If I pull these two parts of the levels in at the bottom, so the highlights and the shadows, we have more contrast in the image, right? So what we said is, anything that was 19 or below in the original image, make it 0, so make it darker. Anything that was 234 or above in the original image, make it 255. So in other words, overexpose anything above that, make it brighter. So we take the histogram only from this distance and we stretch it out to the full width. That has the effect of adding contrast. But if I want to lose contrast, I can do the opposite. So I can actually take the top marks and say anything that was 255 in the original image, don't make it 255 in the output, make it, let's say, 207. And up here on the left, anything that was 0 on the input, make it 237, for example. Now, if anyone looks at that image, for those of you that have been following for a little while, you might find that looks familiar. It's a low contrast image. This is what we would use as an example of trying to dehaze an image. And to dehaze it, what do? Well, we stretch out the top and from the bottom in terms of levels. So we've just done the reverse. But what I'm making sure you understand is that levels can be used both ways. We can drag in the bottom to increase contrast, but we can also drag in the top to reduce contrast. And in this case, I just want to reduce it a touch. So in other words, this stuff here isn't so bright and so different that it's sort of making us squint because it's really, really harsh and high contrast. So I'm just going to bring that in to about there, which reduces the entire amount of anything that's going to be in the highlight section back down to the middle area of our histogram. So it effectively softens the image, it flattens the image slightly. And then possibly finally one final step, I'm just going to add a quick radial mask. So there's a little circle thing here, and that radial mask is going to sit right on the main part of the building here. Okay. And let me just turn the mask on so you can see. So what I've done in this center, when you bring in one of the radial masks, it will automatically give you this equidistant position here. So you've got the main circular shape, so we control the actual shape of the mask with these little dots here. So we can make it more of an ellipse, less of a perfect circle. And if I put my mouse on that middle line, it turns into a rotation tool, so I can rotate it. The inner line, or the inner circle, is the area where the mask will have no effect whatsoever anymore. The outer line is where the mask is at 100%. So between these, we've got an even fall off between 100 down to effectively 50 at this line and down to 0. So if I want this fall off to be smoother, I'm going to shrink the inside. So now the distance that the mask has got to go in order to fall off is a lot longer, makes it smoother, makes it less perceptible that you've got a mask on there in the first place. The other thing you can do, obviously at the moment, as I move these, they're actually moving symmetrically. So the distance between here and here is the same as the distance between here and here. Just like on the radial mask, just like on the the gradient mask and going crazy. If I hold down the Option key, sorry, on the Shift key, I can actually move them not independently, away from the center effectively, which is slightly different to what we've done before. In this case, in this particular case, I'm actually going to make it really small in the center, make this fall off really, really smooth. So on a large area, this is going from 100% mask to 0% mask, and I'm going to place it there. Okay. With that mask set, we're now going to pull down our exposure on the outside, and we're going to increase our clarity. So clarity is going to make that sky pop. So let's go to 100%, way too much. Let's go down to about 30, which is about the normal sort of, somewhere between 20 and 30 is about right. And we're not affecting anything in here. We are slightly affecting the stuff here and here, but nothing down here. Because here we want to protect this, because this was the stuff with all those highlights that were already pretty risky. So if we start putting clarity on, that obviously increases contrast. It's going to make the highlights a little bit more prominent. We don't want that. We've just undone all of that anyway. And that's about it. So if I go before and after with the literal tool, so we go from there, which is particularly bright, a bit difficult to see in some of the buildings, through to here, which has got all the detail back. However, if I create a variant of this shot and reset it, let's compare those two. So here is our original on the right, and here is the new version on the left. So with that keystone correction, with the straightening correction, it all feels very different as a result of just a couple of little tools. Jim has asked, can you use a luma adjustment on the radio? Yes, you can, absolutely. So let's do exactly that. Let's go into our shot here. So let's pull up our radio mask. So the luma range is separate from masking. So you can apply a luma range onto any form of mask, whether that's a gradient, a radial gradient, a hand-drawn one, a soft mask, a hard mask. It makes no odds whatsoever. So let's go to our luma range, and the luma range can pick out certain levels of brightness effectively, or luminosity. So we know that these parts of the church that we didn't want to affect specifically are quite bright. So let's get our luma range to affect everything that's dark and not things that are bright. Now you can see what's happening here, Jim. So as we start to do that, obviously parts of the sky are also going to be affected by that. However, we can always paint them in later if we wanted to. If I were to go to about there and apply that, so now we have no effect on the church for the change that we did in terms of clarity and also our exposure. But if I really wanted to fill in that mask to be clear, I'd now go in with a paintbrush. When I do that, I'm going to put a very soft paintbrush, 100% opacity, make it relatively small. The second I go to start painting, Capture One's going to warn me and say, do you want to rasterize the mask? What it means by that is, as a result of starting to paint on the mask, I lose the ability to alter that mask as a radial gradient. So I have no ability anymore to be able to change the shape of that circle or the fall off or anything like that. But what we can do is we can start with that as a base, choose our luma range as we've just done, and then as a result of rasterizing the mask, we should be able to, no, sorry, I'm being stupid, of course, because we've got a luma range that's set, which actually prevents us from doing it. Good point. So once we've got a luma range set, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever what we do with that mask. This is one of the problems that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. It's funny how things come in circles. So here is the problem with having a luma range which is completely separate to the mask itself. The mask. The mask itself is the area of red stuff that I draw. And that can be through a radial mask, through a gradient mask, or through a brush mask. The luma range is a selection of luminosities that apply to that mask. So in this case, it doesn't make a difference, unfortunately, if I start painting in here, because I haven't rasterized it. Now we've done that. Cool, okay. So now we've done that, my luma range effectively is back and reset to 0 because I've forced the mask to apply effectively at the pixel level. So once we've got a pixel level mask in place, there's nothing I can do with it geometrically, there's nothing I can do with it programmatically. I can't now change, for example, if I were to now draw a new circle on there, a new radial mask, it's a new radial mask completely over this entire layer, because it's lost the fact that this was a radial mask in the first place. So your mask, once it's rasterized, cannot be changed, but it does mean that we can effectively have a new luma range on there if we wanted to, or more importantly, in this case, we can fill parts of the mask that we want, and we can erase parts of the mask that we don't want. So in this case, if I went to our eraser, let's just go here, and let's just click in these trees here, because we don't want to affect those either, or anything down here, so we can erase parts out of the mask too at this point, as a result of it being rasterized. Okay. So that was a bit of a scary moment for a second, but yeah, we're on there. Gotcha. So just remember that your mask and your luma range are two completely different things. You can completely independently alter your mask, but the luma range effectively is a selection on top of that mask of luminosities and brightnesses. Okay, let's go into, so there we go, before and after. Small edit, it's literally just corrected those highlights, but it's made quite a big difference to that shot. Okay, these two from Martin, really, really simple edits actually, because actually the pictures are fine. I'm just going to make a couple of little quick changes. One, we're just going to put some diffraction correction on. And next one, we're just going to rotate this a second, Martin, sorry. So let's just rotate it left a second. Okay, so we've got two shots, both of Iceland. Should have turned off my rotate tool because that's really confused things. So this one here, we've got a lot of detail up here in the cloud. We want to bring that out more. And on this one, I think this is off of Vic somewhere from memory. But we've got a little bit of a lean here on the shot, and we're going to make it a bit more contrasty. These are two really, really quick edits. So straighten tool for a start. Let's draw along our horizon and get the image nice and straight. Same with this one. Now here's a challenge, because this actually isn't straight, but you'll see in a second, once I start to make a crop adjustment, we need a straight line there somewhere. So we're going to make a little bit of a bit of an adjustment that's going to be an artistic adjustment rather than anything else. Okay, so between these two, let's just go to our crop, because I'm going to do something that's probably not going to be that normal. We're going to use a square crop, and I'm going to place these in a position where we've got our interest lines about a third in. There's that one. And the same with this one. Ooh, we had another one of those flashes, didn't we? That's a bit weird. Let's just try something there a second. Try and fix this. Okay, so again, square. And here we go down to here. And what I'm looking for is this lead-in line here in this bottom corner, and a nice straight horizon out there with this out roughly on a 1/3 line. So already we've got two images that now start to feel like a bit of a series, because they're in the same crop, they have the same sort of feeling. On this particular shot, all we're going to do is really, really simple. We're just going to use clarity. And we're just going to make this pop a little bit and just make it a bit higher contrast. We could do some stuff with some levels. You know, we could increase the contrast a touch with this. But other than that, I don't really want to play with this too much. I certainly don't want to be bringing back any shadows or anything like that. I don't want to be bringing back anything in this sand down here. So, you know, if I were to do that, let's go to our HDR tool and bring back shadows. We flatten everything. If anything with shadows, we could actually darken them in this shot. So let's get to there. The rest of it, actually, I kind of like the high contrast look in this image with the silhouette of the rocks out in the distance. Let's just have a little check out here. We're actually okay. There's not any purple fringing out there, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay, this shot, very similar, except I don't want to increase the clarity on this bottom part, so we know how to do that. All we're going to do is pull on our gradient mask, so this one here. If I haven't already got an adjustment layer, all it's going to do is it's going to create an adjustment layer for me on the first gradient mask that I draw. So I'm going to draw this down here. You can see that has appeared on the left as adjustment layer 1. As I pull this down, so we can see the mask is going to apply to the sky quite a lot, 100% above this line, 50% here, and 0%. And obviously I can just pull on this one here to soften just one side of it if I want. Okay, with that set, let's pull our clarity way up on this one. There we go. Let's get the cloud info or cloud detail back in. And the same applies. So overall on our background, not on that adjustment layer on its own, but on our background, let's pull our levels in a little bit to stretch that contrast out, make it a bit more exciting. With our shadows, I'm going to actually make them a bit darker, just like before, so the shadows and black sliders come down a little bit. Our highlights I'm actually going to make a little bit lighter. So normally we'd be pulling highlights down, whites down, and shadows and blacks up, right? Well, in this case, we're actually going to do the opposite because I'm just using those HDR tools to separate out the shadows and the highlights to be able to pull them up. We could do that with a Luma range, of course. But in general terms, it's going to be a lot quicker in this case to just do that with HDR tools. And there we go. There's our two images. So if we go from, in this case, let's go before and after. You saw what we did. It was literally clarity, pretty much. There's a little bit of levels in there, but we go from a relatively low contrast scene up to a much higher contrast scene here. And then on this one, oops, we go from, again, a relatively low contrast scene with the clouds up here as a little bit of a bit of mist. Instead, now we go into a much higher contrast scene and clarity is a lot clearer. That straightening tool that I did here with the land, this may be on a slope. The problem is I'm thinking of a print. And if I have a print on a wall that has every single line that's not level, it just feels uncomfortable, especially when I'm looking purely at a landscape. Okay, so where are we at? One person's saying go for black and white. We can certainly. So on this one, we're not going to gain a huge amount. What we can do is tweak some of the colors as a result. But if I enable black and white, effectively we'd have to play a little bit with our densities of our colors to get it really popping. And also what I tend to find with black and white is we want a little bit of contrast pop as well, just to really get it gritty. In this case here, maybe. Let's have a look. So let's clone that variant. And so that's so that we can go back to the other one. Let's go on to our black and white tool. So enable black and white here. Remember in the black and white tool, these density sliders that I'm playing with here, they affect effectively how bright and dark, it's not quite that simple, but how bright and dark each of the colors are in your black and white conversion. So in this particular case, obviously we had some soil down here, which is brown. Well, one of the primary colors in brown is red. So if I pick on our red slider, we can make it lighter or darker. So we can actually use that information. So for instance, up here is quite blue in its general appearance, and this is a little bit yellow. So we can make our yellows a lot brighter. That's also going to affect the brown, obviously. And we can make our blues a little bit darker there. In this case, on this particular image, I think the color one probably works a bit better than the black and white. But yeah, on the one of Vic, yeah, maybe the black and white's a little bit more dramatic. Claudio, sorry, whichever one is the correct one. Do you ever use the auto on Capture One? Sometimes use it as starting point to see where we can go. Yes, it's a good point. So we'll have a go on an image in a second. You've got this auto adjust button up here. I'll show you some of the things to set up when you do that though, before you get too carried away. So this one is a bit of a fallover from last week. So this is a star shot from Jed. He actually showed me an edited version and the original here. In my view, and again, this is all subjective, it's my view rather than anyone else's, so it can be just as wrong or right as anyone else. I think this version is a little bit too harsh, too contrasting. We've lost a lot of the details in the shadows, whereas in the original, actually, we've got a lot of detail in here. So I'd be tempted to do a slightly different edit. I'm just going to straighten that up for a start. So let's just straighten that line there. Okay. And then with this shot, I'm just going to cool down a little bit in the sky. But remember, whenever we cool down the color temperature, factor in the fact that you might have to bring the tint up a little bit just to neutralize it. Otherwise, it has a tendency to go green. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is this bright red color on this hut, or the barn. I think this is the barn out at Jackson Hole. I think this is the Molten barn. Anyway, maybe wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is. Okay, in which case this is probably a brake light from a car that stopped here on the road. If it is, that can be really annoying, but we've got a color editor in Capture One. So let's use the color editor to fix this. It's pretty quick. So I've got two ways of doing it. I can pick on the red if I know it's red, or I can use this little color picker here, and let's just pick on our color there, and it's just confirmed that it's red. Now I can do this either by using the mouse, up, down, left, right, and you see the sliders on the left change, and the result in the screen change. So what we can do is do that with just mouse movement, or I can do it by obviously using the sliders on the left hand side. But in this case, let's so saturation is up and down with your mouse. So up increases saturation, down decreases saturation. Hue, so changing the color, is right and left on your mouse. So to the right makes it move to the right on the slider, to the left, so it makes it more pink, moving left to the slider. And if you hold down the Option key on your keyboard, you're going to change lightness with the right and left movement of your mouse. So you've got right and left for hue, up and down for saturation, and then Option key or Alt key on Windows, and then again right and left for lightness. So in this case, let's pull up our lightness, down our saturation a little bit, and I'm just going to change our hue to be a little bit warmer to there. So if we do a before and after, from there to there, this feels a lot more natural. It might not be quite there yet, so now obviously we've got another challenge because of some of this, the greeniness that's come as a result. So maybe we also need to change some of the yellow and desaturate some of that, and also some of the green, because there's no green out here in the sky. If we had yellow and green in the sky, any changes I do here is also going to affect that, so I would preferably mask this area and then make any color changes. Because I know I don't have reds and greens out there necessarily, it's pretty safe to do on the whole image in this case. Okay, with that, we didn't do our lens correction. That was a bit bad. Actually, we're okay. We've loaded it all in. Let's just pull in our aberration profile. That's done. Okay, so now with our, back to our, effectively our exposure tab, let's have a look at what we can do with the stars. So let's pull up our whites. So all that's doing is it's picking on the top 5% of that histogram. So if you think about what's in the top 5%, it's these stars. So by pulling it down, pulling it up, it's a very subtle difference, but it is going to make the stars a little bit brighter. We don't really want to affect our highlights too much, because that's not going to have much of an effect at all. But we do want to affect our shadows and our blacks. And the reason for that, the difference is, if I pull up the shadows, the whole of this picture is pretty much sat in the shadows. We can see that from the histogram on the left-hand side. So instead, the more useful thing in Capture One, oops, wrong one to double click, is the black slider, which is the bottom 5% of the histogram. So if we pull that up, all we're affecting then is this part of the foreground here. That's all. Now on top of the whole thing, now I've done that, so I've made our colored balance change and or color change down here in the editor. I'm going to do a filled adjustment layer. And I'm actually going to draw a gradient over the sky. And with this gradient, we're going to increase the contrast. And we're going to actually pull down the shadows a bit more. So effectively, we're making the sky where it is dark, darker, and leaving this barn alone. From there, we could also, if we really wanted to, play with the color of the sky just on that gradient, so not affecting the barn. We don't want to change the barn any more than it was. But to me, so if I look at these two, so let's do before and after on this one. So here's our original shot. There's our edit, which to me looks a lot cleaner, looks a lot more like the night sky, and we haven't lost too much in terms of detail. But if I compare that to the original edit for Jed, I think my gut feel is this one's gone a bit too far, whereas this feels a lot more natural as a Milky Way shot. So I get this one. It is where you've pushed the contrast really high. You've put a lot of clarity in there by the look of it from this halo here on the side. It just doesn't need that much, in my view. You can probably get away with just this one. Something weird going on there before and after, isn't it? Maybe we found a new bug. Who? Yeah, okay. So there's our before, there's our after. Okay. So Jim's saying, how would you address the noise in the lower area? Well, so two ways, Jim, to be honest. One, get a camera that deals with noise very well. So think about the Sony A7R, or say A7S II, I think it is one of the best ones. However, yeah, in general, you're going to have noise in these shots. Generally speaking, the only way that people tend to do it is by having a blended image, so they'll get a clean version of the lower or the foreground with a lower ISO. This was the ISO 6400. That's a pretty high ISO. Yes, we can introduce some noise reduction in here. We can whack these quite a way up, and it's going to smooth that out quite a bit. But you are going to lose some detail as a result. You're going to lose a little bit of texture, but maybe that's okay in this case. What I have just seen though in that little zoom in is out in the stars we're not quite on in terms of sharpness. We're a little bit out. So what I'm just going to do on the stars is go on to our clarity area, and under there we've got structure. The risk with structure is we can introduce noise, but I'm just going to slide it up a little bit to 50%, and that's just made those a little bit sharper still in the sky, rather than losing some of the detail in them. But to me, that would probably be my final edit there. From the before, it's a vast difference, and I just think on this particular shot, this is probably a little bit too far. Okay, where are we next? Hue. We've got two images I want to play with hue. So let's just go into this one here. This one's a very quick one. It's just a case of trying to get this. This is a leopard, right? Leopard's got the spots. That's the one. Yeah. So I'm guessing snow leopard if it's in the snow. So let's get that into more detail, and also let's get all the clarity up on this the falling snow. Now, one of the questions that came with this shot from Hugh was about making the snow not look so muddy when we try and recover any of the detail. So if we cover that first, let's just talk about the detail recovery first, and then we'll go into how we brighten up the. Sorry, Hugh's just pointed out it's a lynx. It's not a leopard. My mistake. Okay, so let's sort out the detail in here. The traditional way of pulling up detail, let's just make sure. Okay, so we haven't got a lens profile for this particular lens. Let's make sure it analyzes for chromatic aberration. We don't, I think, have any purple fringing. No, we're pretty good there, so we'll leave that as it is. But the traditional way, as you know, of pulling up detail, if we've got something that's in the highlights here, would be to pull down our highlights and pull down the whites. That's going to make snow look murky. It doesn't look white anymore, so it doesn't make sense. What we can actually do is pull up our highlights and up the whites to make the snow glisten a bit more. Before we even start playing with this, though, what we are going to do is set our white balance, because to me there's something not quite right about the white balance in this. This snow here is a little bit too cold in the shadow, and these branches look a little bit too green, a little bit too much on the green side. So I'm just going to go onto our white balance tool, go to the picker, and I'm choosing a bit of snow that is not affected by the light conditions. So I'm choosing a bit that's not in the sunshine, that's not in the shadow, because that's always going to go blue, unfortunately, with snow. I'm choosing a bit that's in the sort of general shaded area there. Let's just keep going until I find about the right mix. That's about right there. So we've now got the feel of sunlight. It's a bit warmer. We haven't got this really cold blue in the shadows, but we've still got a certain coolness about the shadow area there in the snow. Right. In terms of getting this detail up without affecting the murkiness of the snow, so we've already increased the highlights and increased the whites to brighter. The reason we can do that is because actually this shot is slightly under exposure in terms of those highlights. We had a little bit of playroom to go on that histogram that we could push it a little bit to the right. So with that done, what we can do, let's just do it with a radial mask just to be really quick. So again, just like before, I'm drawing a radial mask. I'm going to make it a really soft fall off. I'm going to rotate it so it sort of fits around our links. I sound really knowledgeable now that I'm using the right word for the animal. Let's just go there. So I want a really, really soft transition in towards the animal and leaving this forest up here. With the forest, so we know with our mask, so press M on your keyboard to get the mask up, 100% of the mask is affected here, 50% of this line, and 0% in this center line. So with that, and I know I'm affecting the stuff out here, let's go on to our clarity and pump that up, and our structure and pump that up. So if we look at a before and after, if I hold down the Option key and reset temporarily, so that's without, that's with. So without and with. So we've increased contrast, we've increased some of the detail and the texture in the snow, but we haven't actually made it murky or had to darken the snow to do it. So we've just done it with that. For the cat himself, well, let's pull our brightness of the image up. Oops, wrong one. I want on background. Let's pull our brightness of the image up separately. So I'm going to show you a little trick here. If I pull brightness up, it's not going to push stuff off the edge of the histogram. If I pull exposure up, it will. So if I pull our exposure from 0 up to, say, half a stop, look at all this stuff that's now way, way out. It's overexposed on my exposure warning up here. If, however, I do the same with our brightness tool, I have less exposure warnings. They're still there, but it hasn't pushed as much off the end of the histogram. And actually, they're the areas that were already overexposed. So as I pull exposure up, we increase the amount that's going to be pushed off the right-hand side. If I push our brightness up, it increases the overall brightness of the image. It basically squeezes everything to the right-hand side of the histogram without pushing anything off a cliff, effectively. So the brightness tool is great for this because it's going to mean that we can push everything up and much, much brighter without needing to worry about anything falling off that edge and going overexposed, and then effectively there's no detail left in it. Now in these areas here, we actually do have a warning, but it's not necessarily all overexposed. So here on this pink area here, we're at 249, 249, 248. We can read that on the top of the cursor area. That's not actually an overexposed area. It's just Capture One warning me that it's close to being overexposed. If you want to know in Capture One if something is definitely overexposed, you need to change your exposure warning slider to B255. So we get that. We get to that through Preferences. So you go to the Capture One menu, Preferences, and in Preferences you've got this Exposure tab, and under here your exposure warning. The default is set down here, which is warning you when you get close to something being overexposed. You don't have to worry about that because you've still got data. Where you do have to worry about it is when it hits 255. And remember, it's if any of the color channels hit 255. So let's find an example. Difficult on snow. There we go there. So we've got 255 in red, 255 in green, 254 in blue. Overall, it's going to warn you that it's overexposed. So it's if any red, green, or blue channel are overexposed, it's going to warn you. But that change to 255, look at how little it's now telling me is actually overexposed. The other warnings, when it's set down at a lower threshold, it's just telling you stuff that is about to be overexposed. So just be careful with that and remember it's in your preferences. So that's our brightness increased on the overall image. And in fact, I can afford to go a little bit more with this because of what I'm going to do next. On our adjustment layer, which remember is this mask around here, I'm just going to pull the brightness down a touch. Just to about there, just less than the original amount of increase. Okay, so we've got all of our snow detail. It's not overexposed, it's not murky, it's quite clean and so on. We could play with our color editor if we wanted to, just quickly. So let's just pick on, say, this area of the tree here. And again, in this adjustment layer, and the reason is because I don't want to affect this guy here. I just want to affect the area around them. And with the yellow selected, I can actually pull down our saturation here. That's also going to make the snow appear cleaner as well. We could do the same with our greens. We can just desaturate those too. So if I do a before and after, so again, hold down the Option key, you see how warm that looks and how coloured the branches are and the trunks are. Let's turn it on again, and we've gone a bit more cold, a bit more wintry. If we really wanted this cat to pop even more, so let's call that one trees. Let's create a new layer, an empty layer, and we'll call this one links. Let's get the right name. And with our links, we're going to create, again, another radial just over him or her. Don't know how you tell the difference. Let's go there and there. So again, a soft fall off. And with this one, we're going to go into our shadows and pull them up slightly. And our overall exposure just a touch there. But what I've also got to do is invert this mask. Before I start getting too carried away, I noticed it wasn't having any difference. So just remember, that was my bad there. I'm having a bad day today, that's weird. So when you draw your mask, obviously, you can see it when you actually draw the mask, it affects the outside first rather than the inside. If you want it to affect the inside, you can click on Invert Mask, and you'll switch around what it's going to do. Otherwise, you'd have to do the opposite. So with that mask now set correctly, we can now pull up our shadows a touch, and our exposure by nowhere near as much as we did just now. Okay, so there's our before and after. So there's our before, and there's our after. Let's just get rid of that annoying little circle. So So from there to there. The snow's still clean, it's still got detail, it's still got texture. We haven't had to use the HDR tools to bring the snow back in terms of detail, we've just used clarity and structure, but we've got the focus back on this guy here. Okay, this one, I'm going to show you a really cool trick with curves on this one. So this, again, I think this one's from Hugh again. Yeah. So in terms of the detail in this, we have a very flat sky. I think everyone would agree with that. So you've got cloud up here. It's probably very interesting when you saw it. It was probably very cool because it was moving. But there's no real detail or texture up in the sky. It's just quite flat and overcast. So typically we'd pull back, let's say, highlights and whites, and we'd get more detail back, but actually we're not here, which is kind of weird. So we've still got a flat image. And actually all of this data here up in the sky is in this chunk here in our histogram. So for those of you that have seen ones that we've done previously with levels and curves, you're probably going to like this. So in our levels and curves, remember that we can affect how each individual part of the histogram reacts. And we've talked before about having an S-curve in your histogram. So effectively make the lower part of the histogram darker, the higher part of the histogram lighter, and you get more contrast. Well, if I know that all of the data I want to play with is in this section here, I don't want to create an S-curve that affects the whole histogram. But what I could do is create an S-curve that only affects the top half. So let's do that. Let's do there, and let's leave the bottom half how it was. Let's go to about there, let's say. So what am I doing? I'm darkening this section, brightening this section of all of this content, not overexposing anything, so we're leaving it to finish at 255, 255 at the top, leaving this section down the bottom exactly where it was. But if I temporarily undo from there to there, look at all the extra detail and texture we've got in that sky. So we couldn't have done that with highlight recovery or high dynamic range recovery because nothing sat in the highlights to begin with. So pulling down the highlights and the whites isn't going to make any difference. Likewise, it's not going to here. We can compound this by then playing with clarity on top of that curve and also structure. So we go from our flat image there to a lot more detail and texture in this version. And what we've done effectively is taken an S-curve, but instead of doing the S-curve across the whole of the curve, so traditionally in a curve, let's just do it actually so you can see. Let's clone that variant. I'm going to reset my curve. Traditional S-curve, you draw a point in the middle, you make the highlights brighter, and you make the contrast or the low levels and the shadows darker. You get this. Because we've made the darker bits that were already dark and the lighter bits that were already light. But all of that cloud was sat in the lighter area, so it's all got lighter. Instead, by doing a discrete S-curve up in the top section of the histogram only on this curve, we've got all that texture back in the cloud that we didn't have before. So it's gone from this to this, which is a lot more exciting and a lot more powerful. Okay. With that, that's probably, I mean, we could play with contrast. We can, we can bring in another gradient mask along the bottom here. And with that gradient mask, we could probably increase our contrast a touch just to get even more drama out of it. We could pull back that shadow just a touch there. Let's pull up our clarity a little bit. But other than that, I wouldn't touch it too much more. If I clone that and let's just replace all the adjustments. So we go from that as the original to this as the final image. You can see it's very subtle, the difference. But if I look at the detail that's involved in these two images, let's go from where we were before, flat, bit lacking in texture and clarity in the cloud, right the way through to this, which is a lot more dramatic, and we got all that detail back. And the biggest change we did was not HDing. It was not clarity. The biggest change was introducing an S-curve, but not across the whole of the curve, just across the part of the curve that's got this flat data in. If ever you see a part of the curve or a part of the histogram which is just spiky there, it's a prime candidate to just play with the curve on the spike of data and you'll get something like that. Okay, Nicholas says really like that. Yeah, play with it. Do play with it. It can be really cool. Right, I'm going to do one final shot, and it does mean that Trish, we will get to you first next week, I promise. Let's go on to this one. But one of the questions, I think it was actually Trish that asked, is do we use was it Chris? Do we use the auto function? No, it wasn't. It was Claudio. Okay. So auto adjust up here. So here is a shot. Whose shot was this one? This is Alex's shot. Okay. So auto adjust. I can just click that and hope for the best. If you see there's a little arrow here on auto adjust, hold that arrow down. You can choose which parts of the image and the panels you want auto adjust to affect. If you have a phase 1 camera and it's got a digital back that supports rotation and keystoning, you can turn those on. If I turn them on and it doesn't apply to a phase 1 image, it will just warn you and say it couldn't do the rotation or the keystone. But everything else it can. By default, I think one of these is turned off. I can't remember which one, but I think one of these 5 is turned off. Personally, I turn them all on. Let's see what Capture One does. So there's our auto adjust. Now Capture One's done a few things in there. So it's adjusted our white balance, it's adjusted our exposure, our contrast, all of that stuff. It's played with its dynamic range on its own, and it's fixed the levels. To me, I think we can do it slightly differently, but it's a fair point. It's a good place to start. So I think it was Claudio that asked. No, it wasn't that one. Where was it? This one. Do you ever use auto on the Capture One? Sometimes use it as a starting point to see where you can go. Yes, and it's a fair point. But what I would say is, if auto has got you there, I wouldn't worry about turning it off and trying to replicate what it's done in itself. If you're happy with the result out of auto, then use it. What I would do in this case is probably tweak it a little bit. So I can restart this whole process if I want and get it back to where it was at this point, or we can take it from here and we can play with it some more. Now auto, just to be a little bit of a warning, auto can get stuff slightly wrong. So let me just clone this variant. I'm just going to reset all the adjustments. So Jed, sorry what I'm about to do to your image. Let's click on auto adjust. Thinking, there we go, way, auto adjust. Right, so what has Capture One done? Capture One has basically decided to make the exposure balanced. So effectively take our histogram and make it a little bit more central. The result of doing that is we've lost all of that detail in here, because actually the histogram should be stretched out. It should have a lot of stuff in the dark. It was at night. So sometimes when you ask Capture One to do stuff auto, it's going to do a crazy job. Don't rely on it. But where you can use it is, and this is a good example, it's done a good job of this. Let's just go and create a copy of the original. So there's our original. There's our new one. It doesn't look bad at all. So why not start from this point? And actually all we're going to do is probably make a couple of small adjustments. Let's put in a gradient up here. And with that gradient, I'm going to pull down our highlights a little bit and punch our clarity a touch just to get those clouds really, really popping. We can go a little bit further actually with that. We can afford to do that. We could play with our colors in here. So let's go back to our background. Onto our color tab, we've got our color editor. And if I click in this green here, it's chosen this part. And we could increase our saturation a touch, but also make it a bit darker. That's a bit cool. That's good. We could, let's create a, so that's clouds. We could create another mask just over our mountains. Well, not just over, so I'm just going to show you where I'm drawing. So I'm drawing a very rough mask over the mountains. And you'll remember this one, the guys that have been watching it for a little while. We're going to use a luma range, and I'm just going to softly feather that out with our eraser. So with our luma range chosen to go to display mask, I'm going to say I want all the dark stuff, none of the cloud there, really soft fall off, and a nice blurry edge so we don't notice it's a mask. And with that area, let's decrease our exposure, increase our contrast, and probably make our clarity pop a little bit as well. So again, without and with. But auto got us to about 80% of the way there. So to me, it's not a case of necessarily saying to Capture One, right, do an auto adjust and then I'll try and copy that later on. As long as the auto hasn't done anything bad to your image, then why not use that as a baseline and play with it from that point onwards? Because you can then enhance what Capture One has done, as long as Capture One hasn't done something crazy. So in the case of this one, obviously starting from there, you're just going to be undoing everything that auto did. You would have been better starting from the original image. But if it can do it well, in this case it's done a pretty good job of it, then absolutely, and let's look at what it's done. It's done the stuff that we probably would have done anyway. It's changed the white balance a little bit just to cool it down by the look of it. We've got a bit of contrast introduced. All right, let's go to that one. Bit of contrast introduced. It's lowered the exposure in general, lowered the brightness. It's corrected some of the highlights and also some of the shadows, so it's effectively flattened the histogram a little bit, and it's pulled in our levels automatically to the point where it sees data. So they're all things that we would do anyway as part of this image edit, but it's just done a lot of them in one click, and it's done them pretty well. And there's our before, and there's our after. So you guys know how to do this stuff, but if you want to play with auto adjust, give it a play. Hold down the arrow, make sure you've got the 5 selected. I think one of them, as I say, is always by default deselected. Rotation and keystone will only work on a phase 1 digital back. But other than that, yeah, play with it and see what you can do. In fact, use it as a starting point and see where you can take the edit from there. And also, it's quite fun sometimes to see how Capture One sometimes guesses wrong. Anyway, right, so as I say, Trish, we will start with your image next week. There's a bit of a break for a week between now and then. For more information on things like luma ranges and keystoning and stuff like that, remember you've got those pro tip videos. We've also put a poll up to try and work out what people want in the next set of videos that we do. So check that out and have a little play. Sorry, I've just got one question from Hugh. It does not do whites or blacks. No, you're absolutely correct. So it does the highlights and shadows. I don't know whether that's because the auto adjust was done before the whites and blacks change and adding those sliders into Capture One, or whether it's because it just doesn't feel that auto needs it. But no, it doesn't do those two. It only does the highlights and shadows. So remember, send stuff up when you're ready with raw files. Please make sure you include your name. Make sure you include the raw file, not a JPEG. We can't do anything with that. But do send them in. We've got a week between now and our next one, and then we'll see you again next week. In the meantime, have a good rest of the week, and we'll catch you later. Cheers. Bye.